Anurag Gupta is our new colleague at the Middle Project. He's working on a project called Be More, and I'm going to ask him to say a word about that. And Janka is our co-director of the Middle Project, and I'm going to ask him to say a little bit more about that as they answer their questions too. You've heard me talk today about race, but I asked these gentlemen to help us to think about the interrelatedness of race as relates to the 5 issues that we're dealing with today in our conversations. Welcome, Anurag and John.
Thank you.
Anurag, let me start with you and ask you to first introduce yourself and say a word about Be More. But I wonder if you could talk to us about how you see race intersecting with the 5 issues that we're addressing today.
So my name is Anurag Gupta, and I'm the founder and CEO of an organization that I'm starting with the Middle Project called Be More. There's a little pamphlet about that in your folders. Be More stands for Beyond Equality, B, Movement of Opportunities Rising for Everyone, More, Be More. And basically our purpose really is to envision and create an America where we're no longer divided, our humanity is no longer divided along the color line of white and non-white. So that's kind of a tall order that we're building on a movement, as Jacqui so beautifully preached today. And the way we want to do that is to really take academic research from across disciplines. Academics have really researched and discerned specific causes for persistent inequalities and injustices in our nation, and they've written it all, but it's all placed in ivory towers in inaccessible jargon for most people. So we want to take all that very, very inaccessible language and research and translate that into media content, into animation videos, infographics, and things that everyday people can relate to and identify with, because all the stuff that academics study, they study us. They study our lives, right? We're the ones that are impacted by that. And using that work to really shift and raise consciousness around what race is or actually isn't,
right,
so we can actually create solutions to huge numbers of problems and shift systems.
You're really trying to change the story, aren't you,
Exactly.
with the work that you're doing? Yep.
And this takes me to your question. So we're talking about today mass incarceration, criminal justice, education, poverty, gun violence, and health. So there is no biological basis for race. Let me repeat that. There is no biological basis for race. We are 99.9% exactly the same. This is our genetic code, right? This is why when we play, when we're in our bodies, when we dance, we feel the same emotions. But then why, if we're exactly the same, do we have such massive disparities across the board? Why is it that a little black boy has 1 in 3 chances of ending up in a prison in our country? Why is it that under 10% of African Americans live in a census tract without a supermarket? And why is it that 1 in 2 black children, black and Latino kids, go to schools that are high poverty schools? 75% and more of those children are on free or reduced lunch, compared to 7% of white children. What's going on? And this goes to really what you asked. These 5 areas that we're really teaching in on are interconnected. They're interconnected through systems. And this idea of race, which was created 235 years ago, but it persists to this day. What the movement that Dr. King really started, and many, many, many before him started, since the times of slavery, the abolition movement, was to really make us equal in the eyes of the law. The movement that has yet to be done, so that's why we have all these colorblind policies, but they have yet to be implemented on the ground. The movement now is to really shift consciousness so we can enact those promises of human rights that those beautiful people read just now, and of our own Constitution to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. So it doesn't, the police officers, right? There's no manual of the NYPD that says you must stop and frisk, young Black and Latino boys. But why is it that they're doing it? There's no policy that teachers have that you must isolate Black boys and assess them for ADHD. But they are the ones that are being disproportionately affected by that. What's going on? So at Be More, it started with a research project that I was able to do with the Vera Institute of Justice. And we really discerned a new framework for understanding what's causing all these massive disparities across the board. So we went to the academic literature and we began listing specific causes in criminal justice, in health, in education, in employment, and did a meta-analysis, and we came up with 4 root causes that cause these racial disparities. This is why we have gun violence, this is why we have disproportionate poverty, mass incarceration, the achievement gap, health disparities. And what are those 4 root causes? Something that we can understand. First, lack of resources or access to resources in communities where people of color, Black folks, poor folks live. What are resources? Something as simple as supermarkets, something as simple as playgrounds, safe green spaces. Things that societies and communities need to live and thrive and survive are absent in poor communities and communities of color. And we know that from our own experiences. You go to East New York, can you find a supermarket? You go to Brownsville, you go to Jamaica. So once you have lack of resources, and while you have absence of basic resources, you have presence of traumatic environmental factors. Trauma being anything that's life-threatening and emotionally overwhelming. So when there's so much gun violence in our neighborhoods, that's bound to affect our bodies and our minds. But in addition to just violence, interpersonal violence, there's violence that's systemic, that's placed purposely in communities of color. Landfills, toxic waste sites, nuclear waste sites, incinerators, liquor stores, fast food chains. Just as we have toxins in our bodies, these are toxins in communities.
Amen.
And where are these toxins? In poor people's communities, in Black people's communities, right? The third root cause, and this is a very powerful root cause, it's unconscious bias or implicit bias. This is the forefront of neuroscience and social psychology of this day. Basically, they've put people in MRIs and really looked at their brains and what happens to the brain when they flash black and white images. And parts of people's brains light up when they see Black faces. Their amygdala, which is basically the place that activates fight or flight response. This is true for 72% of white Americans. But more importantly, for 50% of Black Americans. This is the cost of race and the stories we tell of race. The conditioning of race in our society and how we portray our humanity, particularly the humanity of people of color, of Black men, of Black women, and everybody affected. And the last and the fourth root cause is institutional policies that are colorblind, they're racially neutral, but enforced in a manner that is discriminatory.
Right.
We have stop and frisk in New York City, right? We have the tax code, which determines how much funding goes into our schools, how much funding goes to our hospitals, depending on where people live. So all of these policies at the systemic level are perpetuating these inequalities, whether it's in health, whether it's poverty or access to employment, whether it's access to transportation. I mean, have you guys wondered why is it that every single train goes to Wall Street, right? Why does every single, and how do they decide which express stops to make? If you've been to DC, you see how circular the tube out there is, right? The metro. And it just completely overlooks Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. What's going on? So it's these root causes, and it's founded upon, again, separation and the otherness of certain people.
Yeah.
And this is where race still plays a role in our life to this day.
Thank you so much for that, Anurag. Thank you. Thank you for that. You and I, when we talk about race, the pamphlet that Thomas Jefferson was writing to France, so to speak, to do a commercial to bring, y'all come to the United States, it's lovely here. In that pamphlet, he writes, I have a suspicion that the Negro is inferior. And that suspicion led to the whole eugenics science, all of the false science about race, where crazy people started collecting skulls and measuring body parts and decided that black people were inferior and made up the word Caucasoid and Mongoloid and Negroid. Promise me when you leave here, you won't use the word Caucasian anymore.
Please,
everybody, make a pledge.
Not use Caucasian.
Do not use white, do not use Caucasoid, do not use Mongol. Those are made-up terms created to accompany the fake science that created race in the universe. Thank you. John. John, you are a white clergyman who, some of that obvious and some of that not. You're a white, you're a white.
Which is that?
The clergy part, no. Who lived through the civil rights movement and have been an activist for, several decades. When you think about race in America, the state of race in America, and how it relates to those 5 issues of, economic disparity, education disparity, healthcare disparity, gun violence, and incarceration rates, why do you think it's important that we attach a race conversation to that conversation of human rights?
When you look at those issues, the one strand that's woven through each one of those issues, and by the way, many other issues that aren't on the table today, is the issue of race. Perhaps some of you have been aware recently of voices that have been raised to say, in celebration of the fact that we're past racism now. Most recently, someone celebrating Rosa Parks for helping end racism. Right. These kinds of attitudes seem to be put forth by people, by and large, who look a lot like me. White folks who have not embraced the notion of privilege, who don't understand the dynamics of diversity, who don't appreciate this culture with all of its potential. So many people being shortchanged to rise up to their potential. So it is this issue of race, I think, Jacqui, that really travels across all of these issues. When you look at connecting these dots, frankly, it's hard not to imagine that there is not something systemic that is weaving them all together. It is systemic. It's not a matter of each of these stands alone in silos. And one of our difficulties, those of us who are trying to work in a progressive way toward change, is that all of us who are working to bring about change, do tend to silo the issues. We keep them separate. We are in a competitive environment for funding to address these issues. And what that essentially does is that it diminishes the critical mass we need to really make an impact. Voices raised in denial of these realities need to have voices to confront them. Anurag's done a great job of giving us stats and information that help to frame some of this. But there is a great value in just telling the stories of people who find themselves in these circumstances. One of the things in terms of education that's now becoming more and more lifted up as an issue is that we're finding ourselves back in a place where the schoolroom is more segregated more and more. Mm-hmm. And so we have abandoned some of the work that was done in decades past and insist on continued evolution. And what I hear are many voices calling for devolution, not evolution. Mm-hmm. Going
Amen.
Back, returning to what was a more secure place for the status quo. So the work we have to do is monumental. Race for me as an issue is the canary in the coal mine. It's where you want to look if you want to begin to assess the relative health of the society.
Right.
If this issue could be effectively addressed, the entire health of this country would be lifted to a better place. So it is a bellwether issue. It's something we need to pay attention to. It's something we need to inform ourselves about. We are an incredibly media consumer society here, and yet how ill-informed we are about some of these issues. We don't find ourselves in conversation often enough about this stuff. We are still dealing with separation by skin color in where we live, where we work, how we find jobs, where we are educated, and where we have access to resources. So these are continuing issues. We all have to be in it for the long haul because that's the name of the game. It's a long haul process. We need to be supporting one another, educating ourselves, and finding ways to take actions.
Thank you, John. I love the, thank you very much. I love what you said about devolution as opposed to evolution. There is, it seems to me in the universe, a kind of pendulum swing toward segregation, separation, white supremacy, just to lay it out, that almost feels like it's in direct response to the election of a black president. That I'm not trying, I don't know about the cause effect in there, but the circumstances that led to a nation that elects a Barack Obama, I think are the same kinds of circumstances that lead to this kind of vitriolic, uncivilized, rude, critical, separatist apartheid that's going up alongside this other movement. So really appreciate that, really do.